What's up, Moto Buddies? Mike here from Taco Moto Co. I've got two manuals here. This is for the 2024. These are, I've got a Husky here on this side and then KTM on this side, and they're specifically for the 450, 500, 501 bikes. I don't have the 350 shown, and we won't go through that because most of the elements are going to be transferable between the different platforms. We'll work out of the Husky bike manual because with the linkage, there's just a few more elements that are a little more complicated, but there are a couple of areas where the two bikes do have spec differences between the two, and when we encounter those, we will jump back and forth between the two bikes, but we'll be working out of the Husky book. On the warranty, it's 6 months if it's plated and 30 days if it's non-plated competition only. On this Husky, we're working out of the European spec manual, and it shows the combination switch. That's got the traction control and quick shifter, map switch, etc. On the US bikes, North American bikes, that is not an option. On the plated bikes, it's only on the competition models. It's not a feature for North America. To set the idle and cold start, on the bottom of the throttle body, there is a yellow fast idle knob, and on the top, there is a red idle knob. The idle speed for the different bikes, if you have a 450, 500, 501 Enduro, it's 1800 to 1900 RPM. If you have a 250 through 350 Enduro, it's 1950 through 2050 RPM. And if you have a competition bike, that'd be a race bike, 250, 350, 450, minimum idle is 2,500 or a 22350. So these are the specs for the different bikes. And then you can read through here and see why you would use the red knob versus the yellow knob. Plated bikes have a new style key for the steering lock, and here's the information regarding that. This section here will cover the maximum gross payload, and it's 739. That's the same for the KTM as well. And so that would be the maximum weight on the tires. That's including the bike, fuel, the rider, gear, passenger, everything cannot exceed that. This section here covers engine break-in, and what it tells you is that you should not operate the engine over 7,000 RPM, and then you should maintain idle below 75%. Also, it's worth noting that these engines ship with Motor X break-in oil. It's a 1040, and then later it will tell you to change the oil at 1 hour. There are many different methods to do engine break-in. We happen to use a practice that's fairly aggressive. We ride very hard right away, straight out of the box. You can use whatever method you feel is best. These are incredibly durable engines, and they can handle almost anything. You can give them right out straight away. The manual procedure, though, is specific, and it's found here. The bike comes with a lithium-ion battery, and in very cold conditions, there are some warm-up procedures, which are noted here. In this preparing for use section, it covers a few of the things that you'll need to look at every time you go out for a ride. Very specifically are the air filter. The book will tell you to look at the air filter every 30 minutes, so you'll have to use your best judgment based on conditions. There's also something important to point out. It talks about checking the electrical connectors for humidity and corrosion to ensure that it is firmly seated. And so essentially what it's saying is be aware that electrical system maintenance is a thing, and you should be looking out for any corrosion on your electrical terminals. When you do your new bike initial setup, electrical system maintenance would be a really key component to that. Also in the same section, it talks about mounting the steel rear sprocket, and this is really something that's ideal for anybody doing long-term riding. The stock bikes come with an aluminum sprocket, which are very light but are not very durable and don't have a long service life. Note here that there is some reference to the spring. This is the DDS clutch spring. The 500 and 501 bikes come with a 280 PSI pressure spring, and then the 450 competition bike comes with a 250 PSI spring. If you're going to be riding that 450 race bike under hard conditions, you can upgrade that spring. Here's the part number, and it's 280 PSI. Worth pointing out, here are things that you should be checking every time you go out on a ride. They're noted in the section. Start the bike, there is a procedure outline that talks about pressing the start button no more than 5 seconds and then waiting 15 seconds before a second attempt. We have a procedure that we've modified over the years, and it's prime the bike 2 times by blipping the starter button, cranking no more than 5 seconds, waiting 10 seconds between a second attempt, cranking no more than 5 seconds. Typically that will start the bike on a cold morning with generally the second or third attempt at the most. Fuel tank capacity on the stock bike is 2.11 US gallons, and then fuel rating is 91 octane. That's in North America. When it comes to strapping down your bike, note that the manual calls for pulling tension from the bottom of the fork clamps. If you have bar systems like flex bars or a MAKO 360, do not pull your strap points from the bars themselves. You will weaken and damage those dampers. Looking at the service schedule, a few things to point out. Programming of the gear position sensor. Your dealer will do that. It does call for having that redone on a routine basis. You can decide whether or not you think that's important. Also, checking the idle speed with a tachometer or other instrument is important to do. Oil change interval is called out. Again, here it's 1 hour for the first, and then 15, 45, 90, and so on. You will have to experiment with what you think the best oil change interval for your bike is. Under extreme, dusty, race type conditions, 5 to 10 hours may be advisable. If you're riding more open road, clean air, dual sport type conditions, you might be able to get away with 50 to 60 hour intervals. We have done that reliably, especially with our mother of all oil filters and a very good oil. We will have some more information just about oil change in later videos. Of note here on the section where it calls out for shock absorber linkage inspection and then greasing, this really is a broader condition, and so this would be anywhere you have grease on the bike. That's like a swing arm, pivot, bearings, and then linkage. Over here, this book is for the Husky, and so this is linkage. Your steering stem. And then over here on the left side, this is KTM, which has a Heim joint and it doesn't have linkage. And so it's fairly controversial as to when you should do chassis greasing. There are some who will say you should do it on a 0 hour bike because there's a limited amount of grease from the factory. They do not pack those bearings and those linkage bearings to overflowing with grease. However, there is sufficient grease on a new 0 hour bike to run for a complete first service interval. And your service interval will really depend dramatically on how you use the bike, what type of service you do, riding service that is. So if you are a racer, you ride in mud, high dust conditions, a lot of wet, you pressure wash your bike, then calling out for regreasing your linkage at 15 hours, you're between 0 and 15 hours, that's probably about your interval. That's short. But if you ride a lot more dual sport conditions and you're out of water, you don't have those other conditions that I described, that 15 hours might be a little short for you. You could get away to 30, 40, 50 hours. It's quite dependent on really how you use that bike and then the exposure to water, mud, and conditions that could degrade those seals and put a little moisture and a little dirt in those seals. So it's a controversial line item. So I'm of the opinion where we will take our bikes and we do not tear them down as soon as we get them from a dealer. We'll ride them. And then we'll just make sure that we pay attention to what kind of conditions we ride them in. And we are generally re-greasing the chassis, typically between 15 to 30 hours, maybe even up to 50 if it's that light duty dual sport type of riding. Your chassis needs grease. When you get it is really going to be based on conditions. Here's something that's very common to the KTM products is for the spokes to loosen up, specifically in the back. So on a 0 hour bike, we will usually check the spokes and then within the first couple hours, plan on finding some loose spokes, plan on getting a torque wrench. Chain tension. Your chain on a KTM product is going to be noisy, especially if it's a PDS. Plan on having more chain noise than you're used to on other bikes. Checking the valve clearance, the book will tell you to do it at 1 hour and then again at 45 and then 90 hours. So we, in practical experience, have had riders who do not check their valves and go all the way to 250 hours. And then on that check, the valves were a little out of spec, but we're within range. If you are riding in high dust conditions, plan on having your valve check be more on a more aggressive scale, a shorter timeline. The cleaner air that you ride in, the farther out you could extend your valve check intervals. Dirty air, riding in dirty air, even with good air filter maintenance, will add some fine grit to your intake air and will accelerate valve seat wear and valve face wear. And so adjusting the valves, you may need to accelerate that based on the cleanliness of the air you ride in. Follow the service schedule if you have any doubt. Changing the fuel filter. There are two fuel filters. There's one on the quick disconnect and then there's one in the tank. This tells us to change the fuel filter at 45 hours and then again at 90. We typically would go to 50 hours on the first change of the in-tank filter, and then we've gone as high as 100 hours for rechanges, and that's if you're using one of the Wix type filters. And then if you use our 250-hour filter, then run it up 250 hours from there. Cleaning out the air filter is very important, and so you may need to do that even a tighter schedule than what the book shows. This item here, checking the inlet membrane, that's essentially the intake reads on North American bikes, and it calls out for the first visual on 45. We've seen where these vibrate loose and come out right away, and that's a maintenance item. So if you are a rider who wants to keep your reads in, which is a fine decision to make, then you're gonna need to keep your eye on those reeds, and they have shown evidence of fraying, and then we've seen some cracks on them, and so it's a replacement item, it's a wear and tear item, and so those reeds probably are gonna be changed out somewhere between the 50 and 100 hour mark based on the type of riding you do and the general type of RPM range that you ride in. Servicing the fork, that's very important, fork oil, and it calls that out for the first 45 hours. And you can work with your suspension tuner on what he thinks is the best interval for that. At 1 hour, and then regular service intervals, it calls for checking all the bolts, screws, and fasteners, and that's super important and should be done. This item here is for the fuel screen. That's that small cone filter that's at the quick disconnect, and that should be checked fairly often. It doesn't necessarily need to always be replaced, but blowing it out backwards with some shop air is ideal. Checking fuel pressure, that's something that a lot of owners neglect, and fuel pressure should be 49 to 51. The way the bike runs, performs, and especially starts is very critical to your fuel pressure, injector flow rate, and then idle speed. And so those three things are very important settings to how your bike starts, idles, and runs, and that should be part of your routine checks. Engine coolant calls being replaced at 24 months. We'll talk more about coolant here in another section. Here it calls out to lubricate the steering stem head bearings. We kind of covered greasing the chassis just a bit ago. Cleaning the spark arrestor. You should be running a spark arrestor so that you stay in Forest Service compliance wherever you ride. And that can booger up with fiberglass out of the packing or just combustion particles. So removing, inspecting, and cleaning the spark arrestor should be part of your general routine maintenance. And that's noted here at the 45 and then 90 hours. The stock springs that come on your bike are rated for a rider who is 165 to 187 pounds. That would be total gross weight, and so that's you with your gear, your backpack, anything that you have on you to equal a total rider weight. Weight is the same whether it's the KTM or the Husky. The clickers on the new 24 bike have the toolless adjusters, which are super convenient. The clicker settings are shown here, and they're the same whether it's a KTM or a Husky bike. Comes to rider and static sag, those numbers are specific to the bike. So for the Husky, it's 40 millimeters for static sag, and then 38 on a KTM. Riding sag is 110 for both bikes. Clickers on the forks are the same for both bikes. This generation bike has a new triple clamp mounting system, and you can flip this bracket here backwards or forwards and gain about 3.5 millimeters of hold distance between these two settings. It's important to note that if you ever remove the front forks, here are the tightening specs. There is a new air filter for the new bike. It's a new shape. It doesn't cross back to the older generations. This section talks about cleaning the spark arrestor. That's shown here on the inside of the cap. There's also packing inside of the muffler itself. That should be checked. We generally do that at about between 150 and 200 hours. Also inside of the muffler is an item called a resonator. That's a little ice cream cone device, and we absolutely recommend leaving that in. Removing that will increase sound, won't really increase power. When it comes to chain slack, the two bikes are different from each other. On the left here is the Husky, right is the KTM, and you'll see that the slack for the Husky is 58 to 61, measured right at the end of the chain slider. On the KTM over here, it's measured at the same spot. It's 55 to 58. There's a specific front wheel mounting procedure for the KTM family of bikes. You'll want to note that here. And the front axle on this generation is a 20 millimeter. And so that means that the 17 model year 17 forward is compatible with this bike. For the rear wheel, in 24, they adjusted now to 22 millimeters on the rear axle, where the previous generation was 20. So you can swap these wheels around, but you'll need specific spacers for the specific model to be able to do that. Spoke torque is 4.4 foot-pounds. Investing in a spoke torque wrench is a good idea. The 24 plus bikes have a new electrical configuration with a device called the OCU, the off-road control unit. We'll look at that in just a second. But here it calls out for a fuse. There's only one fuse on this bike now. and it is a 20 amp, and it's located on the side of the starter solenoid. It's the same exact starter solenoid that KTM products have used for generations now, and it's that 20 amp fuse. Taking a look here briefly at the headlight, there is a new style connector and a new style headlight. It's LED, and that's not the same headlight connector as the past generations. You can swap and you can intermix the headlights between the generations, but you'll need an adapter. If the battery in the speedometer ever is weak, it will indicate this error code. If you see that on the speedo, it's time to replace the battery. The new style bike is equipped with an OCU, that's an off-road control unit. It's essentially a power distribution module. It controls these functions here. Something to point out is the lighting circuit. It is regulated at 100 watts maximum draw. The cooling system has a 1.3 quart capacity, and the coolant should be just about 10 millimeters over the fins in the radiator observed through the radiator fill cap. Throttle cable free play gain is shown here, and there's about 3 to 5 millimeters of play, and that will also, having that adjusted correctly, will enable you to disengage the cold start by moving the grip forward and snapping it back open. You can adjust the characteristic of the throttle response based on the grip cam. Your bike comes with the gray, which is a little bit slower. That's already installed in your bike, but your owner's pack will have this black cam, which has a more aggressive throttle sweep. The inline cone quick disconnect filter is shown here. There's an oil fill level window down by the left side rear brake. When the engine oil is cold, it should be at the bottom of the round ring in the window. If checking it when it's hot, it will be up at the top of the ring in the window. An oil change on this bike consists of removing 3 bolts. There's 2 on the left-hand side of the engine case, 1 on the bottom. Note the one that has the X, that's the Allen head bolt. Absolutely, do not remove that bolt. That contains a spring and a ball, that's the oil pressure bypass assembly. The 13 millimeter bolt, number 2, is the one to remove. The book calls out for an oil screen on number 2 on the bottom. The previous generation bikes all had a short stubby oil screen, that's the transmission oil pickup. And the new generation bikes do not have that. The book has an error. This engine only has 1 oil screen. That's on the left-hand side. That's the long screen. The procedure shown for replacing the oil filter calls out for filling the cavity about 1/3 full of engine oil. You could do that, lay the bike over on the side, or you could pre-soak your oil filter with oil. It'll have the same effect. 7 foot-pounds is the tightening torque on these bolts. Be very careful. Lots of people strip those out. In the troubleshooting guide, in error, the book calls out to check fuses. Since the new bikes have an OCU, that power distribution module, there are no fuses to check. If the ECU has logged an error, it will flash a fast and slow blink code. You can reference these numbers here to see what those troubles are. We like to go in the technical specifications section, and then with the highlighter, mark all of the things that are typical to your maintenance, such as valve clearance and spark plug gap and so on. There's another error shown in the alternator section. It calls that it's a 70 watt stator. That's not correct. It's a 196 watt stator. That's total output at 5,000 RPMs. The spark plug on the new generation bike is the same as the previous generation. A full engine refill is 1.3 quarts, and the book calls out for 10W50. Use the same reference for ASE engine oil weights as you would with a car. Required fuel for this bike is 91 octane US minimum. Dry weight shown for this bike is 244 pounds. It's approximately 260 wet weight. The coolant specified for this bike is a MOTO, that's the M3.0, and that's essentially an ethylene glycol-based oat corrosion inhibitor technology product, which is the same spec as the VW G12 or G12 Plus or the ZREX 30. And so all of those coolant types are interchangeable with each other, and they can be intermixed. Be very careful mixing any other type of coolant with your stock OEM coolant. Engine oil specification is to use an MA2, and they call out for the MOTO product. You can substitute that for any Group 5 ester-based oil. That's our premium and preferred oil choice, using one of those. And examples of that would be the Maxima Pro Plus or the Modal 7100. There's a note here about ethanol. 10% is the maximum allowed. Any higher ethanol content will change the energy density of the fuel and will affect it, so 10% is your max. That's a summary of the owner's manuals for the new bike. And again, this is the 24, so the new chassis, 24, 500, 450, 501 machines. And this chassis was introduced is the 22.5 factory edition 450 bikes, and it's now been rolled into the enduro bikes. and that's why it's all new for this generation. And these manuals, you can print these like we did. The PDFs are on the KTM website, and you can print them out and bind them on your own. What we do is we just download them to a thumb drive, take them to a copy print place, and have them made up for us. Simple as that. So if you have any questions about this overview or anything about the maintenance of your bike, please feel free to reach out to us. Like, subscribe, go out, get some adventure.